In the vivid, vibrant world of Valoran, where skies glimmered in shifting colors and plants pulsed softly with bioluminescent light, Zora had grown accustomed to long stretches of solitude. Her husband, Jor, an accomplished interplanetary diplomat, was frequently away, traveling to distant worlds and forging alliances. Though she respected and even admired his work, the empty spaces left by his absence weighed heavily on her, and there were days when the loneliness settled like a physical presence around her. On one of these lonely evenings, Zora found herself mindlessly scrolling through the intergalactic streaming hub, trying to distract herself. The screen was filled with a bizarre assortment of content, a chaotic mix that was both mesmerizing and surreal. She paused, squinting at one of the headlines, "Hot Alien Girl's Affair with the Donkey Went Too Far." It was followed immediately by another equally absurd title, "Alien Girl asked her chimpanzee to come inside her from behind." A bewildered laugh escaped her, surprising even herself. It was a ridiculous distraction, an oddly comforting reminder that even the vast universe had room for strange stories of connection. But as the laughter faded, so did her brief reprieve from loneliness, leaving her with the empty silence of her quarters. Little did she know, however, that the answer to her loneliness was closer than she could imagine. 2 weeks later, Jor returned from a diplomatic mission with a surprise that would change her life. He arrived home with an enormous creature following in his footsteps, its deep, dark body towering over him. Zora's first reaction was shock. The creature's sheer size was intimidating, its midnight black scales shimmering faintly as it moved. Its eyes, a piercing shade of blue, locked onto her with an unsettling awareness, as though it were studying her as deeply as she was studying it. "This is Maz," Jor said, gesturing to the creature with a note of pride. "I brought him from the Tilon Quadrant. He's a Keldron. They're known for their loyalty and sensitivity." He stepped closer to Zora, his expression softening. "I thought, perhaps when I'm away he could keep you company, so you won't be alone." Zora looked from Jor to Maz, her mind racing. In all her years, she had never seen anything quite like this creature. It was a paradox of strength and gentleness, a figure both intimidating and oddly comforting. The more she looked into Maz's eyes, the more she sensed a depth there, a quiet intelligence and warmth that made her curiosity spark. She smiled, a little uncertainly. "Thank you, Jor. He's magnificent." Jor returned her smile, visibly relieved. "I thought he'd be perfect for you. Keldrons are known to bond deeply with their companions. I wanted you to have someone by your side when I can't be here." He stepped closer, his hand resting on her shoulder. "I know it's been difficult. My work pulls me away so often, but I hope Maz can fill the gap." With a gentle touch, Jor guided her to stand beside Maz, his hand lingering on her back. Zora felt an odd thrill as she extended a hand toward the creature, her fingers brushing over his scaled skin. It was warm, much warmer than she'd expected, and his skin had a soft, almost velvet-like texture despite its reptilian appearance. Maz leaned into her touch slightly, his eyes closing as though savoring the contact. Days turned into weeks, and as Jor prepared for yet another departure, Zora found herself increasingly drawn to Maz's presence. The creature was more than just a companion. He seemed to anticipate her moods, sensing her loneliness before it even surfaced. He would stand quietly beside her in the evenings, his massive form a comforting shadow at her side. They would wander through the luminous forests of Valoran, where the trees glowed with soft phosphorescent light and the air was filled with the sounds of distant, melodic calls of creatures hidden in the foliage. Maz would often lie beside her in the evenings, his deep, calming breaths becoming a rhythmic background as she read or reflected. She would speak to him softly, sharing stories of her life with Jor, of the little memories she cherished. And though he couldn't respond in words, his attentive gaze and occasional soft rumble felt like a response, a silent acknowledgement that she was heard, that her feelings mattered. One evening, as they sat by the edge of a cliff overlooking the valley, she absent-mindedly placed her hand on Maz's broad shoulder. To her surprise, he leaned into her touch, pressing his head gently against her. She laughed softly, touched by the unexpected display of affection, and felt a warmth spread through her chest that was both surprising and deeply comforting. The loneliness that had once been her constant companion began to fade, replaced by a sense of quiet fulfillment. With each passing day, Zora's attachment to Maz grew. He became her confidant, her protector, a friend who offered solace in a way that words could not. She found herself waiting eagerly for their evening walks, for the gentle rumble of his voice as he responded to her presence. In a way she hadn't anticipated, Maz filled a void that she had believed was insurmountable. When Jorah returned from his latest trip, he noticed the change immediately. Zora was more at ease, her demeanor softer, her eyes brighter. She greeted him warmly, but as the days went on, he couldn't ignore the subtle shift in her attention. She was always aware of where Maz was, her eyes often drifting toward him even during conversations with Jorah. And though Maz remained respectfully in the background, there was an unspoken bond between him and Zora that Jorah couldn't ignore. At first he told himself it was his imagination, a byproduct of his own insecurities. But as he watched Zora laugh at something Maz did, her eyes lighting up with a warmth he had once believed was only for him, a quiet unease settled in his heart. The creature he had gifted her as a means of companionship now seemed like a stranger between them, a presence that he couldn't fully understand. Late one evening, as they sat together in their quarters, Jorah voiced his concern. "Zora, you and Maz, you seem." Close, his words were cautious, hesitant, as though he feared the answer. Zora looked at him, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. "Jorah, he's been a wonderful companion. He's helped me in ways I can't even describe." She hesitated, sensing the tension in his gaze. "But it's you I love. Maz has been a comfort, yes, but he doesn't replace you." Jorah nodded, trying to mask his relief, yet the doubt lingered. He couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper had blossomed between Zora and Maz, something he wasn't a part of. And though he had been the one to bring Maz into her life, he found himself questioning his decision, wondering if he had unintentionally invited a rival into their marriage. For Zora, however, Maz had become more than just a companion. He was a symbol of the connection she craved, the bond she had longed for in Jorah's absence. In Maz, she had found a friendship built on quiet understanding, a presence that never demanded, never judged. And as she looked between Jorah and Maz, she felt a pang of conflict, a question taking root in her heart: could one truly love more than one being without betraying the other? As the night deepened, Zora lay awake, caught between gratitude for Jorah's gift and the unexpected feelings Maz had awakened in her. She understood that her heart had expanded, that her bond with Maz was real, and it was something she couldn't ignore. But what it meant for her and Jorah, that was a question she wasn't yet ready to answer. The stage was set for revelations that would challenge them all, testing the bonds of love, trust, and the limits of connection in ways none of them could have foreseen. As the days turned into weeks, Zora found herself drawn deeper into an intense and surprising bond with Maz. What had begun as quiet companionship in Jorah's absence blossomed into something more profound, a connection that transcended words. With Maz, she felt an emotional closeness that she hadn't anticipated, an understanding that ran beneath the surface, almost primal in its depth. His presence had become a steady, grounding force, a warmth she found herself leaning into more and more. Maz was no ordinary creature. His eyes, a luminous blue, held a wisdom and intensity that made her feel seen in a way that no one else, not even Jorah, had ever managed. It was as if Maz could sense her inner thoughts, her buried emotions, without her needing to speak them aloud. He was perceptive, his responses perfectly attuned to her every mood. On days when she felt anxious or lonely, Maz would rest his massive head against her shoulder, a silent but comforting reminder that he was there. One evening, as the light from Valaran's twin moons bathed the landscape in a soft glow, Zora took Maz out to the edge of the crystal cliffs overlooking the valley. The sight was breathtaking, the colors of the planet's luminescent plants shimmering under the moonlight. The cool breeze ruffled Zora's hair as she stood beside him, feeling a deep peace settle over her. Maz seemed to sense it too, his large black form silhouetted against the pale glow of the cliffs as he moved closer. Zora reached out instinctively, running her fingers over the smooth, scaled surface of his neck. It was an action that had become second nature to her, a gesture of affection and trust. Maz leaned into her touch, his body warming under her fingers, and a soft rumble emanated from his chest, a sound she had come to recognize as his way of expressing contentment. She found herself smiling, feeling an unexpected thrill as she sensed his enjoyment of the simple moment they shared. Over time, this physical closeness became a natural part of their relationship. Maz would accompany her on evening walks, his massive frame a comforting presence as they wandered through the bioluminescent groves that dotted the landscape. When they reached her favorite spot, a secluded area beneath the glowing vines of the Kian trees, Maz would settle down beside her, his body curled protectively around her as they watched the stars. One evening, as they rested together beneath the Kian trees, Zora felt an unusual surge of emotion as she looked into Maz's eyes. There was something intense and knowing in his gaze, something that sent a rush of warmth through her chest. She felt her heart beat faster, her breath catching as she realized how deeply she had come to care for him. It was a connection that defied logic, one she couldn't fully explain. He was both a friend and something more, a being who had come to understand her in ways she hadn't thought possible. Caught in the intensity of the moment, Zora reached out, her hand resting on Maz's head, her fingers tracing the delicate ridges of his scales. She felt a strange but exhilarating energy pass between them, a sensation that made her cheeks flush. Maz looked up at her, and for a moment, it was as if the world around them faded, leaving only the two of them, locked in a silent exchange that spoke of an unbreakable bond. After that night, Zora found herself seeking out these moments of closeness more frequently. She became attuned to the subtle ways Maz communicated, how he would press his head against her when he sensed her sadness, or how he would gently nuzzle her hand when she was deep in thought. Their connection was beyond words, something deeper, something that awakened a part of her she hadn't known existed. Yet, as her attachment to Maz grew, so did a subtle, underlying tension. Zora was aware of her husband Jor's return looming closer with each passing day, and she couldn't ignore the feelings that surfaced when she thought about his reaction. She knew that Jor had brought Maz into her life out of love and concern, hoping to ease her loneliness. But now, her bond with Maz had evolved into something complex and unspoken, a connection that filled a space within her she hadn't realized was empty. One evening, as she lay with Maz in her quarters, she found herself tracing gentle patterns along his side, feeling the comforting rise and fall of his breathing. The room was filled with a warm glow, the soft light casting shadows that danced across the walls. Maz turned his head toward her, his gaze steady and penetrating, and Zora felt a pang of longing, a feeling she hadn't experienced so intensely since the early days of her relationship with Jor. As Maz moved closer, resting his head beside her, Zora felt the line between them blur. She closed her eyes, savoring the quiet, the safety, the intimacy of his presence. Maz's warmth was like a balm, easing the ache of loneliness she had carried for so long. Her hand moved to rest over his heart, feeling its steady beat. And in that moment she realized that her feelings for him had grown into something profound, something she could no longer ignore. The following morning, as she went about her routine, the weight of her growing attachment to Maz settled heavily on her mind. She knew she could no longer deny the depth of her bond with him, nor the way he had become intertwined with her sense of self. Maz was more than a companion, he was a source of strength, a soul who had offered her the comfort and understanding she had longed for. And while her love for Jor was undeniable, this connection with Maz felt like a new chapter in her life, one that she had never anticipated but couldn't imagine letting go. Yet, as the day of Jor's return approached, Zora felt a pang of guilt that gnawed at her heart. She wondered if Jor would understand the bond she had developed with Maz, or if he would feel betrayed, replaced in a way that defied explanation. The uncertainty was unsettling, and she found herself questioning her own feelings, unsure of how to balance her love for Jor with the undeniable closeness she shared with Maz. That evening, Zora took Maz back to the Crystal Cliffs, where they had shared so many moments of quiet companionship. She stood beside him, the wind whipping through her hair as she gazed out over the shimmering valley. Maz stood close, his head tilted toward her, sensing the turmoil within her. Without thinking, she reached up, resting her hand on his head, her fingers brushing over his scales in a gesture that had become second nature. "Maz," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "What are we?" Maz didn't respond with words, but his eyes met hers. And in that gaze, she saw the depth of his understanding, his unwavering loyalty. It was an answer in itself, a silent affirmation that he was there for her, no matter what. She felt a rush of gratitude, a fierce love that made her heart ache with its intensity. In that moment, Zora knew that whatever happened, her bond with Maz would remain, an indelible part of who she was. As the stars began to appear overhead, she leaned against him, allowing herself to be held by his strength, to feel the warmth of his presence wrap around her. She closed her eyes, letting the feeling of peace wash over her. In Maz, she had found something she hadn't known. She was missing, a connection that was both profound and healing, a love that transcended the boundaries of words or convention. And as she stood there, entwined with Maz under the endless sky, Zora understood that her heart was vast enough to hold both her love for Jor and her bond with Maz. It was a revelation that filled her with hope and anticipation for the future, a future she was ready to face, not in isolation, but with the strength of the connection she had forged. The day of Jor's return arrived quietly, with little fanfare but a weight of anticipation that Zora could feel in her bones. She waited for him at the landing site, Maz by her side, his towering form a familiar, grounding presence. The ship descended smoothly, and as the doors opened, Zora felt a rush of warmth at the sight of her husband stepping out, his figure bathed in the soft glow of Yularen's twin suns. She moved forward to greet him, and when he pulled her into his arms, she felt a familiar comfort, a reassurance in his embrace. But even in that moment, she felt Maz's steady gaze behind her, his presence a reminder of the bond that had grown in Jor's absence. For a split second, she felt caught between two worlds, the one with Jor, filled with shared memories and love, and the one with Maz, defined by a connection that transcended any friendship she had ever known. Over the next few days, Jor settled back into their home, his energy filling the quiet spaces that had once felt vast and empty. Zora was thrilled to have him home, yet she found herself torn, constantly aware of Maz's silent companionship. He was always there in the background, his eyes following her with an understanding that made her heart twist in ways she couldn't quite define. She felt herself instinctively turning to him in moments of solitude, an instinct Jor couldn't help but notice. One evening, as they sat together in the open-air garden of their quarters, Jor looked up, his expression thoughtful. "Zora, it's wonderful to see you so alive," he said, his voice gentle but edged with something she couldn't quite place. "Maz has been good for you." Zora nodded, a slight warmth coloring her cheeks. "Yes, he's become important to me." She looked at Maz, who stood at a distance, his powerful form silhouetted against the setting suns. She knew that her words were an understatement but couldn't find the right language to convey the depth of their bond. Jor's gaze followed hers, landing on Maz with a contemplative look. "I'm glad," he murmured, but Zora sensed a tension beneath his words. It was subtle, a quiet shift in his energy, but it made her stomach tighten. She wondered if he felt the complexity of her bond with Maz, if he sensed the way it filled the spaces that had once been reserved only for him. The tension grew more pronounced in the days that followed, manifesting in small, almost imperceptible moments. Zora noticed how Jor's eyes would flicker to her whenever she shared a glance with Maz, his gaze darkening slightly, his jaw tightening. She felt caught between them, aware of Jor's discomfort yet unwilling to deny the connection she had with Maz. The unspoken friction hung in the air, an invisible barrier between them that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. One evening, after a quiet dinner, Jor took her hand, his grip firm but hesitant. "Zora," he began, his voice steady but filled with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "I need to ask. Do you feel something for Maz? Something more than companionship?" His question hung in the air, sharp and cutting, and Zora's heart skipped a beat. She could feel the vulnerability in his voice, the fear that lingered beneath his carefully composed expression. She opened her mouth, searching for the right words, but found herself at a loss. How could she explain the complexity of her feelings, the way her heart had expanded to make room for both Jor and Maz? After a long silence, she took a breath, meeting his gaze with honesty. "Jor, I can't deny that Maz has become a part of me in a way I didn't expect. He's been there for me during times when I felt completely alone. But that doesn't change my love for you. It doesn't diminish what we share." Jor's face softened, but the hurt lingered in his eyes. "You say that, Zora, but it's hard not to feel." Replaced, he admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "I brought him here for you, but I never imagined he'd become this important to you. It's like there's a part of you I can't reach anymore." Zora felt a pang of guilt and sadness as she reached out, placing a hand on his cheek. "I'm still yours, Jor. I will always be yours. Maz, he's helped me, yes, but my heart belongs to you." He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, but she sensed his uncertainty, the lingering doubt that shadowed his gaze. She realized then that her bond with Maz had affected Jor in ways she hadn't fully understood. He had given her a gift, a companion to ease her loneliness, but in doing so, he had unwittingly created a rift that now lay between them, fragile and aching. In the days that followed, the tension simmered, an undercurrent of unease that neither of them dared to address. Jor grew more distant, retreating into his work, while Zora found herself drifting toward Maz, seeking the solace and understanding she couldn't find with Jor. It was a painful irony that the very gift meant to bridge the gap between them had instead widened it. One night, unable to sleep, Zora wandered out to the cliffs where she and Maz had often spent quiet evenings together. The air was crisp, the stars shining brightly overhead, and Maz was there, waiting, as if he had known she would come. She sank to the ground beside him, her heart heavy with the weight of her emotions. Maz lowered his head, his eyes filled with an understanding that made her feel both comforted and exposed. She reached out, resting her hand against his warm, scaled skin, feeling the steady pulse of his heartbeat beneath her palm. In that moment, her feelings surged to the surface, the frustration, the confusion, the longing. She realized that her bond with Maz was more than friendship, more than companionship. It was a connection that defied definition, one that had grown quietly but powerfully, a bond forged in shared silence and mutual understanding. As if sensing her turmoil, Maz shifted closer, pressing his head gently against her shoulder. Zora closed her eyes, allowing herself to lean into his warmth, to feel the comfort he offered so willingly. For a moment, all the tension, all the uncertainty, faded, leaving only the quiet intimacy of their shared connection. It was a moment of peace, a respite from the storm that raged within her. But as the stars wheeled overhead, Zora knew that this bond with Maz was something she couldn't ignore or hide. She would have to confront the feeling she held for both him and Jor, to face the truth that her heart had expanded in ways that defied the simple boundaries of love and loyalty. It was a realization both painful and beautiful, a reminder that love was never simple, never confined to easy definitions or clear lines. When she returned home, Jor was waiting for her, his expression tense, his eyes filled with a vulnerability that made her heart ache. Without a word, she crossed the room, reaching for his hand, her touch a silent promise of honesty and openness. "Jor," she whispered, her voice filled with both strength and tenderness. "There's so much I need to tell you." And as they stood there, hand in hand, on the precipice of a conversation that would reshape their relationship, Zora felt a strange sense of relief. She was ready to share the full truth of her heart, to let go of the secrets and unspoken emotions that had weighed her down. Whatever lay ahead, she knew she would face it with courage, with love, and most importantly, with the honesty that her relationships with both Jor and Maz deserved. The unease between Zora and Jor had been growing, a silent tension woven into their every interaction. Zora felt it in the way he would watch her, his gaze lingering each time she shared a glance with Maz or laughed at one of the creature's quiet gestures. Jor's smiles had become tight, his once gentle touch now carrying a hesitation that made her heart ache with unspoken questions. It was as though he were seeing her for the first time and discovering someone he didn't fully recognize. One evening, after another strained dinner, Jor finally broke the silence, his voice sharp with an edge of frustration. "Zora, I feel like you're slipping away from me." His words were careful, but his tone was raw, as though he'd been holding them back for far too long. Zora froze, her pulse quickening. She had known this conversation was coming, but she wasn't prepared for the depth of emotion in his eyes, the hurt, the suspicion. "Jor," she began, choosing her words delicately. "It's not what you think. Maz is my friend. He's been a comfort to me while you've been away." Jor's expression darkened and he shook his head. "Comfort? Zora, he's more than that to you. I can see it every time you look at him. Every time you touch him." He let out a bitter laugh, his gaze turning inward. "I brought him into our home to ease your loneliness, not to take my place." The accusation hit Zora like a blow, and for a moment, all she could do was stare at him, stunned by the intensity of his jealousy. "Jor, you're my husband. No one could ever replace you. Maz has been a companion, yes, but he's not. It's not like that." But Jor was already shaking his head, his jaw set in a hard line. Then why do I feel like a stranger in my own home? His voice cracked slightly, the vulnerability beneath his anger seeping through. You used to look at me the way you look at him now. A painful silence fell between them, each of them struggling to find words that could bridge the growing divide. Zora reached for him, but he pulled away, the hurt in his eyes too raw to mask. I wanted to give you something that would make you happy, Zora. But now, it feels like I've given you something that's taken you away from me. His words sent a shock of guilt through her, a realization of the unintended consequences of her bond with Maz. She wanted to deny it to reassure Zora that her feelings for him were unchanged, but deep down she knew that her connection with Maz had shifted something inside her, a part of her heart that had opened up, expanding in ways she hadn't anticipated. Trying to ease the tension, she whispered, Zora, please don't think that Maz means more to me than you do. You're my heart, my partner. But I can't deny that Maz has become important to me. Not in the way you fear, but he's helped me through times when I was alone, times when I felt lost. But her words only seemed to inflame him further. Important, he repeated, the word bitter in his mouth. Zora, that's the problem. I didn't want him to be important. I wanted him to be a friend, a companion, not someone who would come between us. She took a shaky breath, her emotions swirling as she struggled to understand his pain. Zora, I'm not trying to choose between you. My heart is big enough for both of you. Can't you see that? But Zora's face hardened, his eyes flashing with a hurt she couldn't soothe. I didn't realize I'd have to share you, Zora. Not like this. The silence that followed was thick with unresolved emotions, a tension so sharp it felt like it could snap at any moment. Zora could see the struggle in his eyes, the jealousy he couldn't control, the love he feared was slipping from his grasp. And in that moment she realized just how deeply her bond with Maz had affected Zora, touching insecurities he had hidden even from himself. He turned away, his shoulders tense, and she felt an ache of regret. Knowing that her connection with Maz had wounded him in ways she hadn't foreseen, she wanted to reach out, to hold him, to promise him that her love for him was unwavering. But as she looked at him, she knew that words alone wouldn't heal this rift, that the jealousy and misunderstanding between them had to be faced openly, with a courage she hadn't yet mustered. That night, as Zora lay beside her in bed, his back turned, Zora felt the weight of their silence pressing down on her. She knew this was a test of their relationship, a challenge that would require honesty and vulnerability from both of them. It was a pain she hadn't expected, but one that was forcing her to confront the truth of her feelings for Zora, for Maz, and for the future she wanted to build with them both. In the darkness, she reached out, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. He tensed but didn't pull away, and she took a deep breath, gathering the courage to finally say the words that would begin to bridge the gap between them. Zora, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I'm here, and I'm ready to talk. About everything. The quiet promise hung between them, a fragile hope that perhaps, with honesty and patience, they could find a way forward together. The air was heavy with unsaid words as Zora and Zora sat across from each other in the dim light of their quarters. She could feel his gaze on her, searching, waiting, his usual confidence replaced by an almost hesitant vulnerability. For days now, they had danced around their emotions, each sidestepping the heart of the issue, their connection stretched thin by jealousy, misunderstandings, and the growing presence of Maz in their lives. But now, as they sat in silence, Zora knew it was time to tear down the walls they had both built. Zora, she began, her voice softer than she intended. She reached across the small table between them, her hand resting on his, a gesture both comforting and grounding. I don't want this distance between us. I can see how much this is hurting you. And it's hurting me too. Zora's eyes flickered with emotion, a mixture of relief and raw pain. He squeezed her hand, his voice low and rough. Then tell me, Zora. Help me understand. Because right now it feels like I'm losing you. His words were like a knife twisting in her heart, and she took a shaky breath, gathering the courage to bare her soul to him. You're not losing me, Zora, she whispered. But you need to know that my connection with Maz is real. It's not something I chose or expected, but it's become a part of me. He's been there for me, filling a void I didn't know I had. When you were away, he was my companion, my friend. And over time, he became more than that. Jor's jaw tightened, but he nodded, silently encouraging her to continue. She could see the hurt in his eyes, the struggle to understand, and she knew she had to be fully honest with him to open her heart in a way she hadn't before. "I love you, Jor," she said, her voice trembling with sincerity. "You're my husband, my partner. But my heart, it's grown. I didn't realize that love could expand like this, that it could make room for more without taking away from what we have. Maz, he's important to me. But that doesn't mean I love you any less. It's like he occupies a different space in my heart, a space that doesn't threaten what we share." Jor let out a slow breath, his fingers tracing circles on the back of her hand as he absorbed her words. "I don't know if I can understand it fully, Zora," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "But I want to. I want to understand how you feel, to see things from your perspective. I never wanted to be someone who holds you back, who cages you. I guess I was afraid that, in my absence, I had somehow lost you to him." His vulnerability touched her deeply, and she moved closer, taking both his hands in hers. "You didn't lose me, Jor. You could never lose me," she whispered, her eyes shining with a mixture of love and resolve. "But we both need to be honest about what we want, about what we fear. I need you to know that while Maz has been a comfort to me, it's you who grounds me, who makes me feel whole." Jor's expression softened, the tension easing from his shoulders as he listened. "I've been so focused on the thought of losing you, I forgot to see the ways I might still hold you close," he admitted. "Maybe I need to learn to trust that our love can survive this. That it's strong enough for both of us to have the freedom we need." The air between them felt lighter, the weight of unsaid words dissolving as they laid their hearts bare. Zora leaned forward, brushing her lips against his in a kiss that was both tender and urgent, a promise of their commitment to one another. They held each other tightly, a silent pledge of loyalty and trust, a reminder of the bond they had shared long before Maz had entered their lives. Pulling back slightly, Jor looked into her eyes, his gaze fierce with newfound understanding. "If Maz means that much to you, then he's a part of us now," he said quietly. "But I want to be a part of this too. No more secrets, no more hiding. If we're going to make this work, we need to be open about everything, even the things that scare us." Zora nodded, feeling a sense of relief and gratitude flood through her. "Yes," she agreed, her voice steady. "No more walls. From now on, we face everything together." They sat in silence for a moment, each of them reflecting on the journey they had taken to reach this point, the painful misunderstandings that had tested their love and led them to this moment of openness and honesty. It was a hard-won understanding forged in vulnerability and courage, but it was a foundation they could build on, a new chapter that embraced both their love for each other and the unexpected bond with Maz. As the night deepened, they held each other, hearts open and bare, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead with a renewed sense of trust and unity. In the days that followed their raw and vulnerable conversation, Zora and Jor found themselves moving toward each other with a newfound openness, a quiet understanding woven into every touch, every shared look. It was as if their relationship had been stripped down to its core, revealing a foundation that was both fragile and unbreakably strong, forged in the honesty of their emotions and the courage it took to truly share them. One evening, they stood side by side at the edge of the Crystal Cliffs, a place that had once been Zora's sanctuary with Maz. But now, with Jor at her side, the place felt transformed, not just a retreat but a space of renewal. The sky stretched vast and clear above them, filled with the shimmering stars of Valoran, and Zora felt a calm she hadn't known in months. She turned to Jor, her heart swelling with gratitude and something deeper, a profound respect for the man who stood beside her, open and willing to understand the complexities of her heart. Without a word, she took his hand, intertwining her fingers with his, as they looked out over the glowing valley. Jor's hand tightened around hers, a reassuring presence that told her, without words, that he was with her in this, that he trusted her. There was something electric in the air, a spark that ran between them, different from the wild passions of their early love but just as intense, a deeper, more enduring flame. Jor looked down at her, his gaze warm but searching. "Zora," he murmured, his voice a gentle caress. "In all my journeys, I don't think I've ever seen anything as beautiful as you standing here, with me." He paused, his thumb tracing soft circles along her wrist. "Thank you for sharing your heart with me." for letting me be part of all of this." Zora's breath caught, a rush of warmth spreading through her as she felt the sincerity of his words. She placed a hand on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart, a rhythm that matched her own. "Jor, I've never loved you more than I do now," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "Thank you for seeing me, all of me." They stood there, wrapped in the moment, and the stars above seemed to glow brighter, as if bearing witness to their promise of renewed trust. The vulnerability they had shared, the honesty they had fought to uphold, had given birth to something deeper, a trust that was no longer simply assumed but chosen, a trust they would nurture with every step forward. As they returned home, Maz greeted them with his familiar, calm presence. Jor moved toward him, placing a hand on his sleek, dark scales. For a moment they stood in silence, Jor's hand resting on Maz, Zora's on Jor's shoulder, a small but powerful gesture that bound them all together in the quiet strength of shared understanding. In the following weeks, they built a new rhythm, one that honored both the connection Zora shared with Maz and the love that flowed between her and Jor. They learned to navigate this balance, each moment a choice to trust, to communicate, to stay open. Jor would join them on their evening walks, watching with quiet respect as Zora shared her thoughts with Maz, no longer threatened but grateful for the way Maz had comforted her in his absence. And as they lay together at night, Jor would pull her close, his arms a shelter, his voice a soft murmur in the darkness. They would talk about their days, their dreams, and their fears, leaving nothing hidden, nothing unspoken. Zora felt the strength of their love grow with each conversation, a love that had weathered jealousy and misunderstanding and emerged unbreakable. One evening, as they lay beneath the stars, Jor traced a gentle path along her collarbone, his touch warm and reverent. "Zora," he said softly, his voice laced with wonder, "I feel like I'm discovering you all over again. And I want to keep discovering you every day for as long as I can." Zora smiled, her heart swelling with a love that was both fierce and tender. "Then let's keep discovering each other," she whispered, leaning into him, their foreheads touching, the world around them fading into the background, together. In his arms, with Maz's gentle presence nearby, Zora knew that they had found something rare, a bond that was both expansive and deeply rooted, a love that honored their past while embracing their future. And as they closed their eyes, wrapped in the warmth of each other's presence, they knew that this foundation of trust would carry them through whatever challenges lay ahead.